This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Adam Chandler, former staff writer at The Atlantic, whose work has appeared there as well as in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and a bunch of other places. Today, we'll be talking about his recently released book, 99% Perspiration, a new working history of the American way of life. Adam Chandler, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, as listeners know, I tend to start with titles because I think you give your book a title for a reason. Definitely the case here. So I think a lot of listeners will at least vaguely recognize that from Thomas Edison, but maybe you could talk a little about why that title.
Right. Well, so the title comes from that popular Thomas Edison quote, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." And it's a quote that's kind of everywhere if you're looking for it, you know. I remember middle school posters and in the hallways of this quote and seeing it kind of on self-improvement blogs. And I have a Google alert set up for it for my own purposes. And I kind of see it popped up on LinkedIn and all these different ways. And it's this myth. It's this bit of classic received wisdom about how hard work is kind of the answer to every problem or question in American life. And for the book, you know, it was interesting to me because this hard work ethos is a myth. It's a myth because plenty of people are working hard in America and are barely getting by. And so in the book, I traced this all the way back to Columbus and the Pilgrims, down to the frontier and all the way through to modern hustle culture. But I thought that the quote really encapsulates the American ethos in a really particular way. And to be honest, I kind of wanted to pick on Edison a little bit because he's held up as this historic, singular genius in a way that every couple of generations we have these figures, these characters who emerge in American life and culture who are held up as these larger than life people. And Edison was a genius and he invented a lot of really impressive things, but we don't take into account that he had mentors. He had government assistance and public funds and connections. He had assistants and colleagues and people who helped Edison really become Edison, you know, as we know him. The light bulb is an example that I point to in part because it's one of his most famous inventions, but also because there was a Black American inventor named Lewis Latimer who was working with Edison, and he's the one who invented the carbon filament in the bulb that made it a longer lasting light bulb so that it was actually truly accessible to the masses. And we tend not to hear the name Lewis Latimer that often. So I wanted to bring that individualistic aspect of American life into the story as well. And so Edison really kind of does double work for me.
Yeah. And I think this relates to one of the key concepts in your book that you call, I love this phrase, the American abracadabra. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. Well, we all know the bootstraps myth. It's a huge part of American life and our culture, which is that classic American idea that's up to you to pull yourself up towards success. Lift yourself up by your bootstraps. And what's funny about it is that, you know, many history wonks will tell you, first of all, this was meant as a joke because it's physically impossible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And so for me, the idea of the American abracadabra is this sort of companion to what happens when the bootstraps myth goes wrong. An abracadabra is this trick, this sleight of hand. And in America, it basically says, if you are working hard, you'll get to wherever it is you need to go. And if you don't succeed in the land of opportunity, then you must not have tried hard enough. So it's this kind of thought terminating cliche, to put it one way, that I think is interesting because it really frames work and effort in American life as a matter of character. You know, if you didn't succeed here, you didn't try hard enough. You didn't have the grit, you didn't have the fortitude, and therefore you're kind of a failure. You should feel shame. And those are very potent and powerful things that I think are encoded in American life and at the heart of a lot of anger and rage that people are feeling right now because they are working hard and they're not getting ahead. And that's a big part of our current crisis, you know, politically, civically, socially, that we're living through.
And this is, as I mentioned, a history of the American way of life. And as you referred to earlier, you go, well, way back, right? Columbus is it's about as far back as you're going with the American way of life. And so, I mean, that was a long time ago. And I wonder if you can talk about how that event of Columbus's, well, so-called discovery of America, or maybe how, more properly, how we sort of mythologize that event still shapes our attitudes toward work and success today, more than half a millennia later.
Right. It's amazing to think about, but if you are a British citizen living in the American colonies in the 1760s, and someone asks you, who discovered America? Who discovered the colonies? You would say, most likely an English explorer. You would say John Cabot or Henry Hudson. Even though we know, obviously, that nobody discovered America. Yeah. There were people living here. In fact, there were more people here in North America than there were in Europe, where, you know, Columbus came from. But as the American colonies were kind of moving their way toward independence, they took on Columbus as this exemplar, as this symbol of a new world. And the idea of Columbus was meant to embody the thought that you could be socially mobile. You could make your own way in America. This is what was separate the new world from the old world. And the old world was feudal Europe, where you were born into your title, you were born into land ownership, you had control over people. And so it's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful thought that, like, in this new world, you are not defined by how you're born and to whom you're born and what family you grew up in. You have a way to make your way. And it's a myth. I mean, for some people, it worked out very nicely, but for others, it did not. It has not always been true. And Columbus is the avatar of this idea. And that kind of transcends all the way through it. It is something that's written in our Constitution, no titles of nobility. We are not, in theory, supposed to have people who can lord their exalted status over you in powerful ways. Now, I listen to your podcast enough to know that your listeners know that's not true. But it's interesting to look at as kind of a guiding principle of American life, because it was different and it was something that was meaningful, even though the America that eventually emerged through independence, had features of it that were ugly and that were not inherently equal. And that still is true today in different forms, but it's a big part of our identity nonetheless.
And you go from Columbus to the Puritans and talking about how they saw success and God's favor, if you will. And there's an interesting comment you make about their idea of work as one's calling. And I thought that was I was really interested in that. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how those views really still affect us today.
Absolutely. It's the concept of a vocation or a calling is a religious thing. And many of us look at work as this religious thing in American life. This something that we devote ourselves to and define ourselves by in ways that I think are dangerous. But looking back at the Puritans, this was the only way to kind of prove your worth in the world. The Puritans were ultimately saying that the church was corrupt. And so you needed something to prove your worthiness in this world. And it was devotion to some kind of work, some kind of calling. And if you were successful at that, it was proof that you had earned divine favor. And so it immediately makes success and money and career part of your identity as a way to kind of save yourself, as a way to prove yourself. And that's something that really takes hold. And you can see it in Benjamin Franklin was not a terribly religious person, but he kind of secularizes this idea. He's kind of our first life hack, maybe LinkedIn influencer in the modern era, we would consider him to be. But these are ideas that really take root in American life and are potent today, are very, very part of not just our culture, but the way that we look at work as being something that affords us protection in life, whether it is health insurance or, our welfare policies are predicated around the idea that people who are getting public assistance are working somehow, even though many people are not. And many people are struggling to find work, or struggling to find work that will sustain them. And so it's wrapped up in the political and civic fabric of our lives.
It seems to me that it's like doubly bad, because if you end up not succeeding, then it's not just that you're lazy and you're poor, but also, by the way, you're not going to be saved. So, I mean, Jesus, you're screwed all the way around, essentially. It's just,
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're not quite as, we don't have the religious fervor in the way that we talk about it today, but there's a lot of shame in failure. There's a lot of shame in needing help. Self-reliance is such a huge part of being an American in ways that our peer nations, the ones we compare ourselves most to in Europe, have these robust social safety nets and these things that basically, these safeguards that keep you from falling through the cracks. And you're not supposed to need that here. You're supposed to be self-reliant. And if you somehow don't manage that, if there are so many ways that you can have a snag in your life. You could have a sick family member that you have to take care of that changes your whole life around. And those are the things that you're meant to feel shame if you don't make it here. You're meant to feel shame if you need help. And that's at the heart of some of the, the anger and the fury that I think defines this current political moment. And so even though it has its origins in America of old, it still permeates America of today.
One of your ways you describe Ben Franklin, I love this, is you call him an aggressive coffee and creatine style of ambition that connected money with morality. And I think to a lot of us on the left, it'd be like, oh, that doesn't sound very good. But I think a lot of folks on the right would say, no, this is actually a really good thing, what the Puritans and what Franklin were doing and striving for. And if more Americans actually embrace this, we'd have, greater productivity, faster economic growth, and a better, happier, more prosperous country. What do you think about that sort of critique, largely from the right?
Absolutely. It is central to our politics still. Benjamin Franklin is a person who is a rags to riches story, but he also was a rags to riches story in a time where slavery was still omnipresent in American life. And he also profited as a publisher from posting notices for runaway enslaved people. So he benefited from a system that was inherently unfair, but we tend to lose those details when we lionize our American figures as being found larger than life founders and an important sort of influential, once in a lifetime, once in a generation kind of leader or thinker. And so that's who Franklin embodies in the public memory. But the reality is that he succeeded in a way that is admirable, but also that relied on an economy that was bent and unjust. And that's still true today. But we gloss over those things. We gloss over the particulars of it because it doesn't fit the story. And what I like about the founders in general is they didn't like each other. They had a lot of disagreements. They had a lot of rivalries, intellectual rivalries. They had disagreements about abolition and women's rights and all kinds of different facets of intellectual and religious thought. And I'm interested in that because they managed to come together and create a form of governance that, again, we had the Articles of Confederation, which failed, but they found a way to work it out all the same. And it wasn't because they all united against the British and felt they needed to shake the yoke of tyranny. That's not true. A lot of people who lived in the colonies wanted to remain as English citizens. Some of them just wanted to be neutral. But we managed to come together in spite of all of these things. So it's not about this, sort of beautiful varnished story of American life where everyone realizes we all need to rise up together. It's about compromise and interdependence that I think is a better version of the story. And Franklin is a part of that because people didn't like Benjamin Franklin very much out there.
Moving forward, you talk about in the book Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And I was hoping you could sort of briefly explain that and how this connects into everything that you're focusing on in the book.
Absolutely. Well, talking about self-reliance in general, you can't help but think of rugged frontiersmen crossing the West and settling it. And obviously the history of that, like all of American history, has very many complications to it, including the fact that we threw a lot of people off their land and killed them. But the idea of the frontier thesis is that we are constantly seeking people who need to settle new lands and tame new places and become the fullest expression of ourselves. And again, it's this mythology that is so beautiful and potent and romantic, and also, I'd say heavily tinted by historical lens. And it's fun to look into it to sort of see, even if you look at shows like Yellowstone, people really love this idea of America that is founded by these rough-hewn cowboys and these frontiers people kind of crossing on the trails and risking it all to start a new life. The reality of that is that the government invested in subsidies, in troops, in all kinds of efforts. Big business was involved in these efforts to move west, to cultivate cattle and send beef east. And all of these industries were also beneficiaries of the movement westward. So it isn't a story about individualism. Again, it's a story about business and government and all of us collectively being invested in these big projects that were in some ways good and in some ways very bad. But if you look at the Western mythology of whether it is the frontier thesis or just our obsession with cowboys, our obsession with old time Western swaggering John Wayne types, a lot of that is based on these ideas of these self-reliant individuals kind of taming the West and being their own men. But the reality is much more complicated.
Yeah, all of this that we're talking about, so much of it reminds me of this line from President Obama in 2012 when he's running for re-election. He said, somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we have that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you've got a business, you didn't build that. And of course, the right just seized on that as this horrible thing, right? And I think this encapsulates a lot of what you're talking about and a lot of the differences maybe between how many of us on the left and those on the right sort of understand all this.
Absolutely. And that quote is one of those great sort of oratory moments, examples of that pushback to the story that, again, makes people so angry. The response to that is so furious because people don't want to be told that their success, their hard work was something that we all participated in. We don't have that culturally ingrained in our sort of way of being, in the way that we teach about opportunity and equal access to success in American life. It doesn't have this sort of ground level view of all the things that make it possible. We do have teachers and mentors and all of these really important figures and all of these really important resources for people. We don't have enough of them, obviously, but the people who do succeed have them. And it's important to look at that because that's how we actually build success, is by investing in people, by having time and opportunity to pursue your passions, to develop new skills, to be stronger and more durable providers in our communities. And those are the real answers, more so than just I worked really, really hard and I made it through. And this is something that I feel like we have to continue to say over and over again, that because it gets lost, because the counter programming against this idea is so much about it being an individual aspiration that drives us through, about us standing on our own, when in the reality, that's not how we become strong. And that's not how we have become strong. Looking at the GI Bill as an example of we actually look at that clearly as an investment in people that paid dividends for generations and helped build a durable middle class. That wasn't accessible to everybody. And it was also boosted by the fact that we had strong unions at the time. There are a lot of things that temper that great American story, but not all of them are negative. A lot of them are about helping and investing and being part of a sort of community-minded America that really brings us closer and together in prosperity.
This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
I'm Dr. Jen Ashton, your host for Season 2 of The Visibility Gap, a podcast presented by Cigna Healthcare. Throughout this season, we'll be tackling something vital, the women's health gap. We'll hear from real people and experts as we unpack important topics like maternal health, menopause, and heart disease. Listen in and download the new season wherever you get your podcasts.
Earlier you briefly mentioned hustle culture, and I wanted to talk with you about that. First off, sort of how you understand that term and what you see as being problematic, potentially problematic at least about it. Because of course, a lot of folks hear hustle. Well, it's good to hustle. We should hustle. But there's a downside to that, right?
There is a downside to that. A lot of people are hustling. The origin of hustle comes from Black American vernacular. And a lot of that centers on the idea of making the best of a situation where you are battling economic exclusion. That's the original hustle culture that we came to know of. In Malcolm X's autobiography, he tells Alice Haley about how he's, forever hustling, trying to make things work because he's locked out of access to the American life that other people had. And so that hustle culture has a negative charge to it because it's kind of enveloped all of us. Americans are working harder and longer hours than they ever have. And this is something that when we compare ourselves to our peer nations, we see with fewer hours of sleep, fewer hours of leisure by hundreds over the course of a year. And it's because we are working more for less. Americans have grown 64% more productive in the last 40 years, and our pay has only increased 17%. If you are a person of color or someone without a college degree, your pay has gone down over 40 years in real wages. And those are things that we ultimately forget, but also see in a solution to being hustle culture. You have to hustle harder if you're going to make it here. And so it becomes this, this vicious cycle of you just got to keep working harder and you'll get to wherever it is that you're going to go. And we don't look at the systemic obstacles to success in American life, the cost of everything. We look at it as an individual pursuit that if you fail to hustle hard enough, you are somebody who doesn't have the fortitude to make it in America. And that's a really dangerous thing to do.
I think some people hearing all this would say, yeah, but in the end, the fact that for all of these so-called problems with America's attitude toward work and hyper-individualism and all that, you can't deny the fact that more people try to get into the United States and work here and live here and be citizens than anywhere else in the world. And so that's the final proof that whatever it is we're doing, it's the right thing because people are speaking with their feet whenever they can and trying to come here. Well, what's your response to that?
It's a great point. We have the largest immigrant-born population by far than any other country in the world. And that is part of our dynamism. That increases the pie. That makes us more prosperous. And unfortunately, we, in moments of scarcity or difficulty, of which we've experienced many, right? We tend to blame immigrants for this. We've done it historically. Right now, we're in a moment where we are blaming undocumented immigrants for stealing American jobs, even though I'll tell you, I was a bartender for a long time. I worked in restaurants, I worked in hospitality, and people who are making your food, the people who are picking our produce around the country, these are all people, not entirely everyone, but a huge percentage of which is built on underpaid and often undocumented labor. And things would be much more expensive if that weren't the case. If you look back in history, we have, during the Great Depression, we expelled not just Mexican immigrants, but Mexican Americans who'd been here for generations out of fear of economic instability. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 is another example of a time where we were nervous about our jobs, so we started sort of essentially discriminating against people to keep them out of the country or to force them to leave. So even as we've been this land of opportunity over the years and over the centuries, we haven't done it by giving people the best opportunity to succeed. We claim to be socially mobile, but we don't give people the tools to be socially mobile. And so I would argue that we would benefit as a country if we, again, invested in people rather than focus on these myths that turn out not to be true. There's a Gallup economic opportunity poll that they do every couple of years. And in 2003, 23% of Americans said they were failing to get ahead despite working hard. Now, 23% is not a huge number, but it's a significant portion of American life. And 20 years later, they asked the same question, and 39% of Americans said, I'm failing to get ahead despite working hard. So it's really catching up to us. This idea that you can succeed here through grit and hard work is something that we're becoming cognizant of as being a myth. And it is a big part of our social disruption and anger and fury. And so I would ask anyone who still believes in this unvarnished myth to look at the anger around work and around making ends meet and think about the fact that, medical debt is the highest form of the highest cause of personal bankruptcy in America, or that baby formula is one of the most shoplifted items in America. These are things that aren't the sign of a healthy, stable, durable economy or democracy. These are the things that drive people to say, you know what? I understand that you're saying democracy needs to be preserved, but this democracy isn't working right now. It isn't working for a lot of people. And that's why we are open to xenophobia. It's why we're open to people who are saying, you're doing everything right, so why are you not getting ahead? It must be some external force. It's certainly not systemic. So it speaks to the heart of the moment that we're in. And it needs to be shouted louder than ever that we aren't working to get ahead anymore. We are working to survive. And many of us are falling behind even in that pursuit.
It seems to me, and I've been in the workplace now for quite a number of years. And when I started my adult working life way back in the 90s, things felt different because, at least in one sense, nobody seems to be called a clerk or a stock person or whatever. Everyone's like a team member or a team associate. And especially if you look in the tech world, you've got, I don't know, like free meals, foosball tables, meditation spaces, all this stuff. And I think some people say, well, that's great. You're part of our valuable family and you can take breaks and relax and get back to it. Employers are trying to take care of their employees, but there's a flip side to this too, isn't there?
Of course. I have friends who, when they come to town for work, they'll take me out to dinner because I'm their journalist friend who probably needs a good meal, in the way that I think our parents did when we were in school. Working at a great place like a Google or a Netflix where they give you free, they cover your healthcare and you have unlimited time off, and they have cafeterias and kitchens that will feed you breakfast, lunch, and dinner. These are all things that are meant to cultivate a sense that your employer is providing for you in a way, but it's also a way to keep you in the office. And that's always sort of been the case. It's meant to blur the lines between your personal life outside of work and your professional identity. And that is something that psychologists and workplace consultants have kind of honed over the years is to have you not feel really separate from your job, so that you won't leave your job if you're wrapped up in the identity of your work. People who have unlimited time off, studies have shown, actually take fewer days off than people who have a set number of them. So it's effective in making you feel like those days aren't actually yours. Or instead of leaving your office to get your dry cleaning or go for a walk or get a haircut, if you work for Google, all those things are in front of you. They have on-site barbers now. They have dry cleaning. They have medical offices inside of these facilities where you can get all of your needs basically met. And instead of taking a walk, instead of leaving the office, you can have it all done there. You can have all your meals there. And there's a social cost to this, but there's also in the way that we identify as people. If we're so wrapped up in the identity of our work, it makes it very difficult to dislodge yourself from an unhealthy work environment. And I'd also argue that there's a real difficulty in wrapping yourself up in the identity of your work, in part because work doesn't love you back in this way. If you look at Fortune 500 companies over the last 20 years, if you were working for a Fortune 500 company in the year 2003, and you looked at the list of Fortune 500 companies in 2023, 20 years later, over half of those companies are gone. They didn't fall off the Fortune 500. They ceased to exist. They've been merged, broken up, sold for parts, acquired, whatever it is. They no longer exist. And so these are even the best jobs in the world, in theory, that you would aspire to. And they've fallen apart because even those jobs aren't durable. Even those companies are subject to the whims of the economy, to shareholder demands, to takeovers, and all kinds of other things that mark our economy as being something that isn't meant for durability. And so what's interesting to think about is even if you are at one of these wonderful jobs, you are ultimately vulnerable too. We're not in the 25 years gold watch and pension era anymore. And it's important to look at that when we think about what dream jobs really are and what we ask of each other when we take on an amazing dream job, whether it is something that doesn't pay well, but you're expected to make sacrifices because it is seen as being artistic or creative or some kind of fulfilling calling, or whether it's a job that pays you really well and gives you all these benefits, but you don't leave the office. A lot of companies like high-tech sector jobs are offering things like egg freezing opportunities for female employees to delay their family planning for a couple of years because they want to get more years out of them before they settle down and have families and potentially leave or become less efficient workers in their minds. So it really is a double-edged sword in this way.
A lot of folks seem to think, especially with the how AI has taken off in the last few years, that there's this potential for work to change in a truly fundamental way that none of us have experienced, with a lot of jobs being eliminated. And there have been calls really across the political spectrum, oddly, for something like a universal basic income. And for a lot of folks, that's sort of a scary thing, because they would argue that, well, this kind of thing incentivizes complacency, laziness, that sort of thing. And not only that, but there is something to be said for feeling a sense of worth and pride in your work that potentially could be taken away. And so I wanted to get your take on UBI and how it might, affect how we see work, for better or for worse.
Sure. And I appreciate that question in part because we do have these giveaways. We do essentially have a universal basic income in some form or another for our wealthiest Americans. And it sort of manifests in tax cuts or carried interest loopholes, or the fact that we tax assets at a lower level than we do income. You can write your mortgage interest off on your taxes. These are all things that are essentially gimmies and giveaways for the wealthiest people in this country. And we don't look at them as handouts. Only when you are on the lower income bracket do people tend to look at SNAP benefits or Medicaid as being something that we are essentially giving away to people who are undeserving and not working hard enough. So there's that aspect of it. But UBI itself, I talked to the mayor of Baltimore in the book, who is one of the many people who have been essentially working to create all of these different pilot programs to test out UBI and see what happens when you invest in people. And in Baltimore, the program is they give $1,000 a month for 2 years to families who are in poverty, young parents from the ages of 18 to 24. It's very targeted. And the idea around it is, what would it mean to have parents who are able to say no to a bad job and find a better one, or study more, or get different certifications so that they can have a better career, or simply spend more time with their kids during the early years of their lives and be present parents, which has economic benefits that would blow your mind. Sociologists and people who study family histories and dynamics show often that the fact that the present parent makes an enormous difference in the trajectory of a child, more so than anything that happens at a school and anything that happens at a community. It's having engaged parents. And so UBI is a safeguard against AI, but it's also a way to boost our economic standing among workers who need this help. And we had experiments with it even during the pandemic. You could look at the expanded child tax credit, which gave every parent $250 to $300 a month for each child as a way of saying childcare is work. And it cut child poverty by more than half. And instead of being extended, we ultimately let it expire. And we went back to the same precarity where we don't look at childcare or taking care of anybody who's in need as being something that benefits the economy and is something that is work. And so we already have a system where UBI does exist and where UBI is actually needed and is proven in all these different ways to show benefits, material benefits, economic benefits, social benefits to people. And we just can't make it into an arguable case that everyone should have it, and without these odd preconditions to make it actually benefit us. So I talked to Andrew Yang in this book, and he's an example of somebody who, again, sees the AI revolution as being something that could potentially put millions of people out of work. And it's absolutely a possibility. So what do you do then if millions and millions of people are suddenly out of work? If you have a universal basic income set, you can at least have people have some kind of set budget in their lives that they can work with to start picking up other jobs or find new ways to plug into a modern economy that's changing quickly. And so I like to make the economic argument for this because it does benefit us to have people who aren't jumping from bad job to bad job, who can actually be socially mobile because they have the opportunity to get childcare or take care of people in their lives so that they can work or so that they can be a benefit to their community. And these are all things that a UBI or any form of that, and it could be the child tax credit, it could be a negative income tax. These are all things that we've been toying with and tinkering with over the decades. And the proof, again, shows over and over again that these are smart initiatives that benefit us.
I think what a lot of folks on the right would worry about or would say in response to that is if you give people this sort of basic income and they can be picky about jobs, well, what that's going to inevitably mean is that employers are going to have to pay higher wages, and that means that consumers are going to have to pay more. And so we're going to end up seeing sort of an inflationary effect to this. Is that a concern of yours?
It's not a concern of mine, in part because we've seen higher wages take root in places like California, where they showed in the fast food industry raising the minimum wage to $15 and then going above that didn't affect consumer prices. It wasn't linked to either unemployment or higher consumer prices. There are all of these intensive research studies and efforts into decoding this because it's such an important part of the question of what would happen to our country and our economy if we did give people a monthly boost. And it ultimately pays for itself in productivity. Businesses, for example, lose $1 trillion. American businesses each year lose over $1 trillion to worker attrition. And that is people who are leaving jobs that don't pay well enough or don't have secure scheduling or don't provide enough basic stability or benefits to keep people employed. And I'm talking a lot about places like Walmart or Amazon or the fast food industry. And if you took that $1 trillion, and by the way, if I were an Amazon shareholder and I saw the amount of losses that happened over the course of a year because workers just can't stand to stay there for more than a couple of months, I would be angry because I would want more profit from having workers stay on. When you lose an employee to attrition, oftentimes it is because the job didn't pay well enough or there wasn't enough attention focused on an employee's trajectory at the company. They saw no way to benefit long-term investment in the work itself. And you would actually make more profit if you spent a little bit more time and money making sure your workers felt like they had a place there, that they were secure there. And so it's smarter business to look at this as a way to create more loyal, more creative, and more directed employees rather than taking that all away by raising wages or whatever the argument is. There's just so much counter evidence to that again would not just improve our economy, but would improve our communities too.
And toward the end of the book, you consider alternatives to this sort of American model, and you look at the French, specifically the French approach to work. And I was hoping you could say a little bit about how you see that as differing from how Americans typically see work, and what we might be able to learn, perhaps, or benefit from that French attitude.
Sure. This goes back to conversation where we were having a little bit about identity. And this is something that, Professor Jason Reed talked about a few weeks ago that I thought was really fascinating about the way that we identify with our jobs and how that is kind of a new phenomenon. And in France, what I think is interesting, and by the way, we shouldn't become France and we shouldn't adopt everything that France does. I want to be clear about that. But there is a way of doing business in France where you have these cultural norms that are set. If you're at the office at 8 p.m., you're not heroically showing that you are committed to cause, to your company, toward getting ahead. If someone is at the office at 8 o'clock at night, people will wonder, are we understaffed? Are you the wrong person for this job? Is there some kind of inefficiency that keeps you here? Because you shouldn't be here at this hour. You should be out living your life. You should be home. You should be with your family. These are things that we've kind of absorbed as being parts of the work-life experience that prove ourselves by staying late, by grinding it out. And in other countries, it's just not the norm there. And we sacrifice a lot by doing that. In France specifically, they have all of these safeguards that are kind of built in. And again, it's not totally by law. These are just things that work between unions and employees and companies themselves to create boundaries that create social norms. So in France, it's written into the labor code that you are supposed to leave your office for at least an hour for lunch, and if not more. And this goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Because of tuberculosis, they would air out the offices and make sure that it was a safe work environment. But they realized that by having some time off during the day, it benefited employees and it benefited the bottom line to have people have some time to take for themselves, run errands, be social, connect with their coworkers in non-work terms. And they continue to uphold it over the decades as proof that this is important. They also instituted something called the right to disconnect, which a lot of countries have followed, which essentially says if you are working and after hours, text, an email, a Slack, some kind of message comes through, you're not obligated to respond to it. Now, it's not a whole cloth law that everyone can ignore it. It's something that you have to work out with your employer, but it creates a norm where you shouldn't expect to be getting emails from people or expect to have to respond to emails, text messages, whatever it is after hours, because that's your own time. You should be able to kind of separate yourself from your work life. And these are important things that I really do think speak to a difference in culture and a difference in attitude about work that we could stand to have healthier boundaries, in part because there is a real cost to us being so wholly focused on our jobs. And it is not just in mental health. It's not just in social health and community health. It comes down to people being able to stay at jobs longer and to enjoy what they do and to not have to indulge in self-care and all of these other kind of weird woo-woo responses to the fact that work is just too overwhelming and too all-encompassing. We shouldn't have to have these different solutions to the problem when you could just have a better balance, and it would benefit us immensely to do that.
Yeah, a few years ago, my wife and I went to Italy and France. We were thinking about maybe buying a house there, moving there. And on the flip side of things, it was really frustrating to sort of try to deal with this European, I guess I'll call it Western European attitude toward work, because, like, for instance, in Italy, we literally could not get in touch with a real estate agent. Or in France, we'd be going places and there'd be a sign on a store saying closed for like an hour and a half for lunch. It was just, it kind of blew our minds, you know. It was just very, very different. And so I get the benefits certainly for the workers, but as a consumer or a potential consumer, I got to say, I'm so used to the American approach where you can reach anyone, anywhere for anything that involved money. That really was kind of a shock to me.
Yeah, absolutely. In the book, I go to Normandy and I'm touring around these old World War II sites. And, you know, a lot of this the focus of going there is a lot about American purpose and identity. But there's this moment that, you know, kind of replays in my mind where we are running a little bit late because we wanted to make a few extra stops and we only have a short period of time for lunch. And so we have a bunch of Americans in this tour bus, and we have a couple of people from other countries. And so the host very politely says, listen, I really hate to say this, but we're going to have to rush for this lunch before we go to our next stop. We're only going to have 15 minutes for lunch. And the Americans are like, no problem. This is totally normal. I'm going to I'll grab a sandwich and we'll go. We'll do it. 15 minutes is a luxury. Go make it less. And we have a few Europeans who are also touring around who are sort of 15 minutes. What can you do in 15 minutes? Like, I can have a glass of wine and a coffee and then a full meal in that period of time. And those are two extreme things, right? There's got to be a middle ground somewhere between those two where it makes a little bit more sense, where, okay, a shorter period of time should be set aside for lunch and for time away, but it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be 2 hours. It doesn't have to be totally leisure rich. But I do think that we have an extreme version of it. And I think that Europe in many instances has an extreme version of it. And I think that we could take some cues from the European model and make it a little bit better here. And we would see how much easier life becomes as a result of that. So I'm not wholesale buying into the European model where you get all of August off, even though I'm sure that there are benefits to that warrant it continuing to be tradition there. And again, there are plenty of people who don't get those times off in Europe, who are working difficult jobs and who are getting paid under the table and who have the same economic disadvantages that we have here. But as a cultural norm, it does seem more important to prioritize people having the opportunity to live their lives and to have breaks from work that are just kind of built in. And I'm sure that people adapt to that in Europe upon arrival. And I know it's jarring for us to sort of interact with that, but it's also funny to hear stories of people who come to the US to work and who just have no idea what they're getting themselves into in terms of what they're expected of, in terms of the hours that they work, in terms of the availability, in terms of how much they are meant to sacrifice to work for an American company or to have an American colleagues who expect answers at all odd hours of the night.
I think a lot of folks would say, well, that sounds great, but you need to understand that this sort of laid back approach comes at a cost. For instance, U.S. and French worker productivity per hour worked is roughly the same. But if you look at GDP growth since 1980, the U.S. is around 2.63% per year, around 1.75% for France. That might not seem like a big difference, but what that means is that over that period, France's economy grew around 45% more slowly than that of the U.S. And I think a lot of folks would say, well, wow, that's too big of a price to pay. I was wondering what you think about that.
Well, that's a great point. But I would also say that the economy in the last 40 years in the U.S. has more than doubled. But again, we are still seeing a lot of people making so much less, or basically the same as they were 40 years ago, as a result of our policies, but also our decisions about work and how we tells people how we essentially arrange the economy and focus on giving businesses the right of way in this country to determine what work culture is, instead of having workers and employees have any input in it whatsoever. And so even though France's economy is obviously slower and the quality of life in a lot of ways is less, the benefit of having one more hour of leisure a day, which is what France averages, the average French worker gets one more hour of sleep and one more hour of leisure per day than an American worker. And they also live longer. They live 5 years longer than the average American, and spend half as much on healthcare. So I'm not saying that we should become France, but I do think that there are things that we could take out of that book, that out of their worker manual, that would benefit us immensely in terms of how we are functioning as an economy that treats people as if they are disposable. And yeah, it's notoriously hard to fire people in France, but it's also, they also have worker regulations there that make it easier to stay at a job longer because you feel like you're invested in it, like you're part of it, like you have a say in the future of a company. So neither model is perfect, but I will say is the last 40 years in American life, if you look at what workers have gone through, they would probably take slower productivity or slower growth over the more hours, less money, less time, less community that we're living through here.
You end the book with a chapter called A New Patriotism. And I think a lot of folks would say, well, what does patriotism have to do with work? And what is this whole new patriotism thing that you're envisioning? So maybe you could address that.
Absolutely. Well, we've lost a real sense of citizenship beyond the fact that we pay our taxes. We've become economically and politically more divided. We've been gerrymandered out of living in places where people around us tend to disagree. We used to live in communities where there were people who, by and large, disagreed on politics. You used to have people who were doctors and dock workers living in the same blocks, whose kids went to the same school and played together. And that is something that has changed over the course of the several decades because of the way that our communities are structured and because of income inequality. And as a result of it, we have this great social distortion, this sort of domestic unfamiliarity with each other. And so I'm calling for, and plenty of smart people, I speak to General Stanley McChrystal in the book, who talks about national service, and not just in the army, but volunteerism, being involved in jobs that, high schoolers in the 80s and 90s used to work summer jobs and instead of internships that would get them into better colleges. Having access to each other, being involved in our communities more, and really seeing and understanding what everyone is going through would strengthen us immensely. And talking about old and young, rural and urban, rich and poor, bringing people together is something that we absolutely need to do if we're going to get out of this crisis that we're in, because we have become strangers to each other. And our politics suffers as a result of it. We don't have people who are willing to compromise in Congress or in our politics generally, because there is no cost. If you live in an area that is 70% blue or 70% red, you can kind of do whatever you want and still get reelected. And that means that you can be as extreme as you want to be and not find common ground anymore. And so that patriotism has eroded as a result of it. We are more individualistic than ever. And the social cost of that is enormous. And so we have to find ways to plug ourselves back in. A lot of that revolves around work. It revolves around taking time away from work to be there for our friends and our family and our community, and being Americans as citizens and not individuals.
You've obviously thought a lot about work and Americans' attitude towards work and where we're at right now. And in doing all this thinking about it and looking at the current scene, is there anything that you can see or point to that makes you feel at least somewhat optimistic about the future of work in America?
Surprisingly, yes. For this book, I traveled around all the country. I met with a high school teacher in rural Indiana. I met with a pastor in Alabama. I talked to people who are working on green jobs and apprenticeships in Wisconsin. All of these different people, when you talk to them in their communities about opportunity, about what their version of an American dream is, once you get past that initial sense that, okay, this is somebody that I probably disagree with politically, when you get into the basics of what life should be, what an American life should be, there's so much overlap and consensus about what people really want, what people really feel is possible if we were to make some changes. And so in that weird way, it did strike me as being an opportunity. We do have consensus on a lot of major things, despite the fact that our politics are so divided. And so these are all opportunities for us to, again, break out of our echo chambers and bubbles, to look around us and see, by and large, people have similar views of the direction we should be going and of what we ultimately want. And it's really hard to see that right now, but getting to travel around the country and talk to different people about what they want and what their lives are like and what they wish their communities could do for them and what they could do for their communities really opened my eyes to the sense that we all are yearning in a lot of ways for the same things. And, we may call them different names, we may have different ways of framing it, but there is a lot of similarity that still exists. And so even though there's plenty to be pessimistic about, there is still something beyond all that noise that is meaningful.
Well, I'd say on that sort of guardedly optimistic note is a good place to close it. So we'll do that. Adam Chandler, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Mike, this is a real pleasure for me. Thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you do.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at Politics Guys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,